All right, I'm excited. Welcome to Killer Psychologist. Today we have Dr. Nicholas Baham. He is a true crime noir author that I recently just met, and I'm fascinated by authors that write true crime because honestly, I grew up with Nancy Drew, and I was just fascinated by mysteries, and probably that's why I got into my line of work. I love a good mystery. But I want to hear the story behind it, the author. I want to hear more about your intention behind becoming an author, this particular book, and how it's going to link to our discussion today about sex trafficking and Sean Puffy Combs. So a little bit of background about Dr. Nicholas Baham. He is a professor. Besides, he has his PhD, but he's a professor in ethnic studies at California State University in East Bay and Oakland. And so he's appeared internationally, and he's recognized as a scholar. He's appeared in many publications and media outlets such as Esquire magazine, BBC documentary films, and Austrian publication Radio, Canadian Sex TV, and BET. He is also an author of several other books, including The Coltrane Church, Apostles of Sound, Agents of Social Justice, and The Podcaster's Dilemma, Decolonizing Podcasters in the Era of Surveillance Capitalism. So today we get to sit down with him, and we did have a chat the other day too, just to meet and greet. And then I'm like, okay, we got to stop talking. Let's save this for the podcast. So thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I want to learn more about your passion for writing. And I noticed in one of your quotes, you said you love to impact people's lives in meaningful ways. And your book, people write novels for a reason. There's a message in there that you want to get out. You're obviously well educated. You're a professor. And so you've written this book. So I would just love to hear just a brief, plot and theme in your novel.
All right. The People's Detective, out now on Bootstrap Publications and available everywhere, is a novel that's set in contemporary Oakland, California. Actually, it takes place right before the pandemic. So that's where the series begins. And it centrally deals with the crime of sex trafficking in Oakland, California, and the Bay Area. Turns out that because Oakland is one of the more major ports in the United States of America, it is a hub of sex trafficking, the Bay Area as a whole. In 2023, there were some 1,500 women who came up, were reported missing. Over 400 of them were Black women. This is, by the way, a very, very diverse part of the state of California and of the United States. And I wanted to write about this because I also teach a class at Cal State East Bay called Black Sexualities. And part of what we have to do in Black Sexualities is we do the work of sexual liberation and forward thinking, but we also have to deal with the past. And that includes everything from the legacy of how bodies were treated during enslavement, through mass incarceration, era of lynching, obviously before that, and what's going on now. So even as we try to build healthy lives and sexualities and sexual self-understanding for ourselves right now, there are things that are happening in our world that are always affecting that. And it turns out that sex trafficking is one of those. It's also one of the more highly underreported crimes in the United States in general. We just don't speak to this very much. And I have some ideas about why I think it's underreported, why I think it continues to go on. And I wanted to write a book that kind of brought together many of the stories that I'd heard about people who were trafficked, even people that I had met who were trafficked, and in an entertaining way, but in an informative way, um, presented my ideas for how it might be happening. And for me, this is always about, when you see crimes that are as long lasting, and as sex trafficking, go on without major reporting or major police busts. For me, I always begin to understand that there are police involved in this. There are city officials involved in this. There are wealthy people involved in this, influential people involved. We're not just talking about small-time street hoodlums who are involved in this kind of crime. It may be sort of woven into the very fabric of how business is done in the city. And that was the story that I wanted to tell. So there's a lot of gritty realism in the novel, but there's also some fantastical folkloric elements of it as well, and a lot of speculation.
Oh, I just saw Heidi pop up and then she went away. Heidi, you don't need anything from us, do you? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's the dark side of life that that I think a lot of people don't want to think about from day to day or aren't exposed to, but somebody needs to talk about it.
Yeah, when I teach the Black Sexualities course, I always have a student who will come to me at some point in time during the class and say, "Look, this happened to me," or that happened to me. And these are stories of trafficking. These are having been trafficked. These are stories of people in some way or the other having been exploited, in some cases by a loved one, someone in the family, or someone that they thought that they loved, and who loved them back. And something switched up. And technically, if we start from the beginning here, sex trafficking is when someone is forced, coerced, or through some fraudulent means convinced to have sex with other persons for someone else's commercial benefit. We tend to think of it as always involving movement across state or national lines, but it actually doesn't have to happen that way. In fact, on my own companion podcast for the book, I interviewed an activist by the name of Teresa Flores, who started an organization called the Soap Project. And I can talk a little bit about what they do as well, if you'd like. But she was also a victim of sex trafficking. She never left her home. She wasn't trafficked by family. She was trafficked by someone who had filmed himself having sex with her while she was under the influence of drugs. So he had drugged her against her will, had sex with her, filmed it, and then used that film in order to shame her, essentially saying, if you don't do the things that I'm asking you to do, then you're going to get exposed. I'm going to expose this to your family. They're going to know about all these things that you've done. And, this is, look, all she did, all that happened here was that she left her home at night, in the middle of the night, snuck out of the windows, etc., and got in his car and went to whoever's apartment she was taking, performed sex acts, was, of course, never paid for it. When she tried to break free, that was when they showed her how violent they could be. So they went as far as, I think at one point in time, they killed her dog, to demonstrate their power to her, the things that they were willing to do. But this is a kind of a classic case of sex trafficking in many respects that doesn't involve movement across state lines. She stayed at home. It's still sex trafficking nonetheless. And perhaps there needs to be a bigger term or a broader term to describe this.
I agree. I don't love that term. I feel like people have a preconceived notion about it. But like you said, each story can be different. And I think people need to have a lot of awareness of how just insidious or subtle that it can be, of how it introduces itself. It could be somebody you know or a relationship you're in. And it takes a turn. I just would comment and say, I worked inpatient in a psychiatric facility for 4 years. So I encountered many people most people who enter the facility they have a positive toxicology screen, but many stories I encountered were people had non-consensual sex and were drugged, and many different stories across time that I've heard from being just so many, really hundreds. And so it really opened up my eyes of how complicated it is. And of course, as a mandated reporter, it could get very complicated to get the details because even they didn't have all the information if you're drugged or your memory is impaired, or even if you did have it all, how to report it. And it's just shocking.
Yeah, many people don't know that they've been trafficked, even while in the midst of it or after. This was also the case with Teresa Flores, but I've had heard stories from my students of being at a party with a boyfriend who then essentially makes them available sexually for other friends who are at the party, which is, when we get to discussing Sean Diddy Combs, that's a little bit of what is going on there. And then there's manipulation afterwards. There tends to always be drugs involved. I had a student who was attempting to reunite with her father after many years. And what he did was he would take her to fancy places and show her off. All of a sudden, his friends would show up, and his male friends would show up. And he would sit them down and talk about how beautiful his daughter was and this and that. And she got a vibe about things that were happening, the way she was being introduced to his group of friends. You don't want to think that a loved one is going to do that to you, but there had been some distance. He had not really been in her life, first of all, right? And so she started to question, well, what's happening here? There are other things too, like debt peonage. For example, you may owe someone a debt, and then they present this as a way to pay off that debt.
Yeah, absolutely. And get you introduced to a drug you weren't even interested in before, lure you into thinking you're taking or consuming something else, like even fentanyl, and then next thing you know, you're impaired, you're under the influence, or maybe even later you're addicted or you're needing that, and this is how you get it.
Right. And look, this is problematic not just because it brings people under the scope and influence of sex traffickers who may do things to them that are obviously damaging to body and mind, and damage the rest of their lives, right? And give them something that they really need to deal with now for the rest of their lives. But, you also have to question how much of that, every victim thinks about, how much of that can I bring into court? Do I have something that's actionable? I was on drugs when this happened. Does that testimony stand up in court? I did voluntarily come to this party, or at least apparently voluntarily come to this party, where I was introduced to this person, albeit under false pretenses. But how much of that is actionable in a court proceeding as well. Because oftentimes we're talking about extremely powerful people who can say, look, we were all grown-ups here. We knew we all knew what was going on. You agreed to this. You came voluntarily, or what appears to be voluntarily. We were all under the influence of something or the other. And so it becomes difficult in court, particularly in a society that, just to be frank about this, we're still living in a society that privileges the testimonies of rich and powerful men. And you're seeing this even with Puffy Combs. Immediately, there's the defense, the sort of defense that's being thrown out of, he's a family man, pillar of the community. He's received the city to the key to the city of New York, honorary degree from Howard University. He's given to charitable causes. He's got children. He's a family man. You may have slipped up once or twice, but he's a good, honorable family man. Who are you? Who are you?
And they will ask, who are you?
Yes.
And for most of us, public speaking or just putting ourselves out there is hard to do. So imagine your sexual history on trial, or personal details about yourself you were prepared to go to your grave with, and now you're on trial. So just public humiliation, and there's shame. And I represent victims in cases of sexual abuse, and it's going through that legal process is, they're reliving all the trauma, and it's horrifying.
Yeah.
And they relive it. They'll cry for hours and hours and hours with me. So to hear that, I'm traumatized, like secondary trauma. So it is so difficult for these women to come forward. I can tell you that. And going up against powerful people, they do ask me, like, is this going to be worth it? Like, because they have to put it all out there. And then in the end, nothing may come of it. Okay.
That's right.
Do you understand, like, for people to take a moment and be in that position, just for a moment, think about that. All the public ridicule, put yourself out there and maybe get nothing, right? Like no financial compensation. And there's no financial compensation in the world that can undo all of that. That's not what it's about. People go to great lengths to tell their story, and it's
really something. It's particularly when you consider that two of the bigger cases that we've dealt with over the past few years, Epstein and Weinstein. So Weinstein, that's out because of evidentiary constitutional issues. And then with Epstein, we're dealing with death. So is there resolution for people who came forward for either of those two? And that's why, for me, it was really important in writing this novel that, so look, I've got a male central character who's the private investigator, but the action happens because of women. The story that we're dealing with in the book has been discovered by a woman who is a investigative journalist. And the plot, as far as the private detective is concerned, his job is to really help that private, that investigative journalist who has been kidnapped because of her story. So he has to find her and then make sure that story gets out. But the actual work has been done by this woman who is an investigative journalist. And I try to, these are fictionalized versions, but I try to recapture the stories that victims tell her, understanding that victims are going to trust her. And then I also insert into the novel transcripts from a podcast that she runs, a fictional podcast that she runs, where she talks about victims. It humanizes victims of sex trafficking. I think that's another thing that's really important. We have to recognize that These are human beings. These are people with hopes, aspirations. They wanted to do something in their lives before this happened to them. They have families. They have loved ones. There is nothing about them that justifies these things having happened to them. And we do have to think about them as something other than just victims, but as three-dimensional human beings who have had to endure these crimes.
And how do you get out?
How do you get out of situations like this?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the difficult piece, and I think that there are some people who have, frankly, who have not. Um, the stories are wide ranging. There are people who managed to escape or run away. There were stories that I read, and by the way, I read stories from newspaper articles going back as far as the late 1980s. Not only in Oakland, but I managed at some point in time in my research to uncover police reports from Washington D.C. So I looked for anything and everything throughout the country that was in the form of some form of journalism or reporting or police reports, and also that came from websites by survivor organizations. So there are a number of organizations that I list at the end of the novel that help survivors. They also put up the stories of survivors. And typically, people find a way at some point, those who have escaped, that is, to run away. They get away at some point and seek refuge. Some of that is facilitated by things like what Teresa Flores is doing now with the Soap Project. So what she does is she understands that a lot of the trafficking, the exchange of sex for money happens in hotels and motels in particular. So she puts soap into motels. Now, when you're in the bathroom in a private moment, if there's a Soap Project bar of soap there, it's wrapped. So someone has to undo the wrapper. When you undo the wrapper to get to the soap, there's information about who you can call if you are a victim of trafficking. So if you're running or you're thinking about running from this particular motel or some other situation, she has within that wrapper a list of resources that you can go to. Some of this is available online. That's what some of these advocacy organizations do. Soap Project, Missy, there are a number of them that are out there advocating, trying to provide information to people who may be trafficked, so they know that there's someplace you can run. And some of this is more pervasive in certain parts of the country than in others. The last time I was in Atlanta and I was in the airport, I noticed the amount of signs around the Atlanta airport about trafficking, spotting trafficking, and phone numbers that you could call if you were being trafficked. So where there's an investment in getting the word out and publicly acknowledging to people who may be trafficked out there, look, there are authorities, there are sources, there are people, organizations that you can go to. That's all to the better. That gives you some place to run to, somebody you can call.
Wow. I did not know about the Soap Project, but I did know that, when I travel, I've been noticing in the women's bathrooms, on the bathroom stall.
Yeah.
And I love seeing that information there. Just reminding people that it's present. Just giving them that opportunity. I love that it's there. And I know it's in bars and in those bathroom stalls, and just even about domestic violence as well. So just like
right,
normalizing that this is a common problem, just providing information, providing support, have a conversation with people, and having the hotline. I've worked the hotline, and I know many people that work these free hotlines, and I would just encourage anyone to call, just to even talk. I'm talking about domestic violence, sexual abuse, anything, right? You're just not sure. you just want to talk about it to figure out, just to talk to someone.
Yeah, and this also obviously includes anybody who might be listening to this podcast. I was really moved when I interviewed Teresa Flores by her statement that even after she had escaped from it, she didn't fully understand that she had been trafficked. And she didn't understand that she had been trafficked until she came into contact with, I think she mentions that there was some kind of presentation that she went to. And it was at that point in time that she realized I was trafficked. That's what happened to me. But she didn't really have a name for it, even after having escaped from it. It was just this hell that she had lived through for so many years. So there is that space where somebody could be listening to your podcast now and coming to awareness about what's happening to them. Because what we've talked about so far sort of encompasses the situation that they're in.
I want to mention OnlyFans. And, people can be behind a camera and do certain things and have subscribers that get paid. And, I understand it's lucrative. I personally don't have an OnlyFans account, but I have heard stories and quite concerning the people that are on there and some of these, I'm going to say transactions, but it's disappointing that how it starts out for many people, maybe trying to make some money, but there can be in some of the stories I've heard, like it gets to a level of desperation where you're wanting money and then you cross lines to do certain things or invite people over, or then you're at a point of no return is what I'm saying. Right.
Yeah.
A point of no return, and you open the door to people and things you wouldn't ordinarily have done, but it was enticing for many reasons, prominent businessmen, money, things, but it turns out you got duped and now you're not in control of anything anymore. And it may even appear that you are, but you're involved in.
Yeah, there's a proximity between sex work and in particular porn and trafficking. There's a relationship there. And we see this really clearly in the Sean Combs case, where he held these freak parties, right? Where he invited male sex workers to these parties for these marathon sex sessions, essentially bringing someone sexually to their and physically to their absolute limits and then beyond, because you're introducing drugs as well, cocaine in particular, to continue to push people. There's a fair amount of that I also include in my book. In fact, in my novel, there's a character who is a sex worker who understands that proximity between these two worlds, who is a close friend of the central detective in this story. And I wrote that because in many of the narratives that I had read of survivors, there was so much of an overlap between these spaces. So some of them were trafficked and starred in these amateur films. That was a part of the trafficking. Some of the odder cases are cases of women who were trafficked and then became a part forcibly in the administration of these kinds of things. In other words, they ran websites that furthered the trafficking business that was trafficking them, or they maintained kind of the amateur porn filming that they had been trafficked into, and that was now trafficking other young women. And those are very strange stories, because what happens when the trafficking ring gets busted is that even though you've been trafficked, you've been placed in a position where you're also maintaining the business. And so you wind up standing trial as a trafficker, even if you're technically also a victim who was trafficked. There are a lot of cases of this, of people who are doing time, but were essentially victims of the entire operation. They didn't, they're forced to run the operation. So there is a proximity there. And there's a question too about, which I don't have the answer to, Dana, but I think it is worth thinking through. It's one that was part of the conversation I had with Teresa, and that is whether or not the legalization of sex work will or will not help to end sex trafficking. There's a lot of conventional wisdom that suggests that that would be the case. But Teresa informed me that there are a lot of sex traffickers who are just waiting on the sidelines for sex work to become legal in America, to open up more business for them. And to some extent, this makes sense if you consider that people are trafficked in quasi-legal businesses already, like massage parlors.
I believe it. It's, man, yeah, I think it's highly problematic. Like things like we talked about, something can start out as I am, trading for sex. I'm a prostitute, I'm a sex worker. Like that's a way I'm going to make money. And I've worked with the unhomed population and people that do that type of work. So I hear many stories, but I have yet there's always a point where it crosses over and they're being forced to do things. They're being pushed past a point. They're being drugged and raped, essentially, is what I'm saying.
Right.
And they don't report it for the most obvious reasons. They don't.
These are vulnerable people, right? In some cases, we are talking about immigrants. We are almost always talking about someone who is poor. We may be talking about someone who has social emotional difference as well as the possibility of simply being someone who is spotted as being vulnerable, underconfident, if you will, needy in some way. This is what, there are people in our world, unfortunately, who have trained themselves to be able to spot folks that they can take advantage of.
I work, I would say, with the most vulnerable population. So people incarcerated, people that are unhomed, intellectual disabilities, mental illness, severe mental illness, all those factors, immigrants, so all these different backgrounds that make them so susceptible and not even knowing their rights about even their legal rights, okay? Because that's one of the things I assess. So to even understand the criminal justice process or why you would report, how that would work out, what that looks like. So I try to provide a lot of education to people at various stages of the criminal justice process of how to report, what to do, the process, how to be safe, how to get resources, how to get supported, crime victim witness. So like resources to support them after they report, right? Like to even go in hiding, safe at home programs, next level things. To the reason why they don't report is because what is that going to do for me except for hurt me or make my situation worse? And that's where we're at. Like if I try to negotiate reporting with them, how's this going to work out for me? Right. And
yeah, it's difficult. When you're looking at someone who's already in a really difficult position in life, and then they're facing this violence, this threat of violence, manipulation. I learned when I was doing the research that there are all kinds of situations that produce vulnerable people for sex traffickers. Even natural disasters that displace individuals from their homes can produce people who now are needy. And there are folks who prey upon those communities. Wherever the social safety net has fallen out for someone, it produces individuals who are susceptible to this. It's just, if you don't operate with, if you're not criminal minded, right? To cite a hip hop title, if you're not criminal minded, you don't think about things like this. But this is what a criminal mind, someone who is trafficking, is thinking about. That's an opportunity. Oh, there's a flood, there's an earthquake, there's a natural disaster, there's a crisis. That's an opportunity, find somebody who's vulnerable.
Beware the person that comes in to save the day.
Yeah.
Beware. I am aware. Beware of the person, that comes to help you fix your flat tire on the side of the road. Like, beware of the person that's offering you money. Just beware of the person that's overly friendly and just a little bit too interested in you and helping you out. All of these things, and I try to teach women and men like boundaries and to protect yourself from being a victim and being in those vulnerable situations where you feel, and I always teach people, you never get in the car. I have a lot to say about that one, but I've many people who've gotten into a car with a person, and I'm talking about a date, a ride to the tire shop, hitchhiking. I mean, a number of reasons why somebody you don't know, okay, that I'll never do it. You just, boy, I'm so jaded. I mean, I this is the world we live in, and it is dark, and you have to protect yourself. And I feel fortunate to be in a position to help educate others on safety or resources. And, I want to prevent victimization. And people that are in these situations, this conversation we're having right now, that there is help, there are resources. I do want to empower people to report. And I know we talked a lot about women, but I wanted to also mention that while most of my clients are men incarcerated or in these situations, I have heard more stories of men getting raped than one could imagine. And even did one case where I interviewed, it was about 38 men in a specific 2-month period that I interviewed their whole story. So the grooming, the introduction, the molestation, I've heard, a spectrum of crimes. So what I learned, because I always ask them, what can I learn? How can I help the future? What message can I say? But so most of those crimes are definitely not reported. Men are not reporting crime. I'm telling you, because I talk to them, and that's a whole nother level of shame. I mean, it's hard enough. I'm a woman, like I miss, but for men, it's very difficult as well. And I feel like I don't know. I feel like sometimes they feel left out, like to be encouraged to report or talk about these things. Like they feel so like demasculized. Did I say that right?
Yeah. Demasculated, yeah. The men that I've interviewed, they've been married their whole life or had kids, family, second marriage, on and on. They've never told their spouse, never told their family, never told their kids, never, ever, ever. And so they go to their grave with it, is what I'm saying. So they're definitely not reporting, which is a huge problem. And
I wish more men would speak out. And I'm always interested to hear the men that have their story to share it as well.
Yeah, it's important to talk about that because men are trafficked. Also, trans women and trans men are trafficked, and the Sean Combs case also involves men who are trafficked. Look, there were men who were brought in for these freak offs, but there are also men who have testified. Um, they're there are men who there's a man by the name of Rodney Jones, for example, who accused Combs of, and he has some understanding of the entire RICO enterprise that he's involved in, and some of the criminal conduct. And there's some other men who have claimed that that he tried to groom them. So this is this thing that we're about to talk about with him, with Sean Combs, is also something that does involve men as much as it involves women. It's interesting because I used to ask myself the question of what is it with sort of an equal opportunity offender like this? And I think the important thing to understand, and I think where people often get confused with stuff like this, is that rape, first of all, rape isn't sex. Rape is a violent act that's committed upon someone's sexual person and their sexual body. But it's about power. It's a violent act that's about power. And it may not necessarily have anything to do with whether the bodies of the persons who are violated are cis male, cis female, or trans. It's simply that the body is violated. When I was in college, there was a guy that I went to school with who was kicked out a couple of times, but they always let him back in because his father was wealthy. And he had attempted 2 rapes while he was in college, of one of a woman and one of a man. And we would have discussions about this. What's going on? What sort of equal opportunity rapist, do we have here? How do we define their sexuality? But you have to step outside of that and realize this is not about defining sexuality. It doesn't have anything to do with it. It has to do with the need to exert power over someone's body in this horribly violent way. That's what he was looking for. And that's what he was enjoying. And in fact, when you look at some of the facts that are involved in the Sean Combs indictment, we are talking about not just men and women, but we are talking about instances where Combs himself is involved in committing the act. Sometimes he's just watching. Sometimes he's presented someone to someone else. For example, the rapper Little Bow Wow has already talked about being 15 and having grown women presented to him by Sean Combs. So obviously, this is power writ large. He considers himself a really powerful person who can control the bodies of individuals around him. And that's part of it, right? I have $750 million and I can get anybody to do anything that I want them to do at any particular time. And that's what he's enjoying, it seems to me. I'm curious about your take on this as a psychologist. If I'm anywhere in the ballpark with thinking through the motivations for stuff like this.
I do court-ordered sex offender evaluations too for convicted sexual offenders, and even come up with sentencing recommendations, or I do the clinical psychological testing on these folks from all different types of people, and so I get to learn a lot about them, and I there are different types of offenders, but like you said, power and control. I have yet to see a sexual offender who wasn't abused when they were younger sexually. I have yet. So there's usually something in their past. So, like you were mentioning, someone's introduced to you, whether it's a prostitute, someone that grooming, because I know a lot about grooming and how it's introduced. And then that person, let's just say, Diddy in this case, someone could have groomed him and it became deeply ingrained in their psyche and normalized. And they'd be like hypersexualized at a very young age. And that their sexual deviance and their behaviors, this is who they are now in relationships. Whereas in a normal, healthy relationship where you become of age and you date, flirt, and you kiss, or eventually, like someone and it's consensual and you have that experience in your life, these other types of people don't have that experience, and they're groomers. And groomers are grooming. If people can understand grooming, it looks so, a lot of people can't detect it, but it's all the things, right? It could be buying you things, promising you things, giving you things, all these wonderful things you'll actually get. Okay. But that's just part of the process, building up your trust, getting you alone, and then you're eventually in a relationship with this person, right? And so there's definitely these types of individuals. They have a whole grooming process. It's very manipulative, and the longer they do it, the more insidious it can become. And typically, there's drug use, right? If we're going to blur the lines, cross the lines, right? If I need to take you past the point, right? Most of the child molesters, or all of the dozens of men I've interviewed that were molested as children, church camps or different people, they were always introduced a drug, porn, something they wanted, just have a hit, they had this alliance between them, but don't tell your parents. So they always offered them something that kind of the kid wanted, but then got them addicted.
Yeah, it seems to be what this young man, Rodney, and actually I don't know how old Rodney is right now, but Rodney Jones is saying he was a part of Combs' operation, filmed Combs having sex, traveled with Combs, procured women for Combs, and then at some point in time was sexually harassed by Combs and has accused Combs of attempting to groom him for sex.
There's no boundaries after that.
There are no boundaries. You're right. Yeah, that's it.
Once you're past that point sexually where the sex of a person, no, it doesn't matter anymore. We are way past the point. Like, it's the power and control, like anyone around them. Like you just want to be, you can't. Yeah. I mean, beware, because a lot of these people may have started as a business associate or coming to a party, but he crossed the line. Like these, and eventually he's taken advantage of so many people.
Right. I mean, there is a question here. Just looking at the indictment, there are several counts here. There's sex trafficking, forced labor, interstate transportation for the purposes of prostitution, which is also known as the 1910 Mann Act. They tried to get rid of the first black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, with that act. In fact, they did convict him on that. What's that?
Say that again.
It's called the interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution, but technically this is called the 1910 Mann Act, MANN. It was a law that was written to protect against the enslavement of young white women. And it's been used against a lot of people. I think they used it against Frank Lloyd Wright at some point in time. But they also used it against the first black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, who openly dated and married white women during the era of lynching when black men were being lynched for looking at white women. That was at least the allegation. They weren't actually lynching them for that reason. They were lynching them because they were economically and politically successful. But that's what that is. That mention of interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution. Then there's coercion and enticement to engage in prostitution, narcotics offenses, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. So what you see the feds doing is that they're building a case that covers acts, means, and purpose. So how did he acquire the labor? How did he coerce people? And why did he do it? There are some other questions too that I think are worth asking as the case develops, and as your listeners hear the facts coming out. I want to know if children were involved. We know that that's been the case in other high-profile cases. R. Kelly, a case in point. Who else was involved? Because specifically in this indictment, Combs Enterprises is named. So they are going after him under the business as well as a person, apparently. I want to know what role police and law enforcement played. When you study, try to learn about these cases, I found a lot of cases of, women were running away from their captors down the street, sometimes half clothed and screaming. And when the police arrived, they wound up leaving that person back in the home of the abductor for one reason or the other. So I really want to know what's involved there. Also, I'm interested in, are we going to put rap culture on trial? Because I kind of feel like rap culture and the music industry escaped Me Too. And I'm not sure why.
It escaped you?
It escaped the Me Too movement. I mean, we went after Hollywood, but we didn't go after the industry that we all know is involved in this kind of activity and has been involved in this kind of activity for a long time. How did music escape?
Well, it's going down now.
For sure, yeah. And then I also want to know, is Sean Combs going to offer evidence against others? Because I keep thinking about the fact that, so he's been denied bail. They're not playing with him, right?
Well, if you think about Epstein, and of course, he's gone. He got, well, maybe he got taken out. But certainly he had a lot to say about other people who knew things that were very powerful people. And as the case with Sean Combs, certainly, like, man, money talks. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's, you even know, like, in, a lot of people aren't paid a lot of money, and just with changes everything. So for you just not to say anything, for you just to look the other way, for you just to do this one thing, those people in positions of power, there's going to be a lot of people implicated, and who's going to talk, right? And Epstein had the power to talk, but he, that's silenced, right? So,
Right.
And I understand Sean is on, suicide watch. And of course, I'm sure a lot of people would like to silence him pretty quickly and segregate him, because, he's very powerful.
Extremely. And knows a lot of other even more powerful people.
And even while this is going on in real time, like, people are scrambling, right? Is my name going to go down?
Yeah.
And it's just a mess of collusion and, just so far reaching it's so widespread, but it's about damn time, right, that we're got to this point, right, where he's, indicted, he's incarcerated. Finally, there's going to be a trial, right? Like, how long has this been going on? How many hundreds? Like, this, I will be quite curious to see the other people that were involved that may have gone just invisible under our eyes, like their association. And in this industry, right? This power play, right? He had power, money, all those things to elevate your status. And what is that trade-off or exchange? You never want to be involved with anyone like this. I always tell people, like, stay clear. This guy is, but I people are going to go down. That's for sure.
You would think, unless as you suggest, the same thing happens to him that happened to Epstein, which may not have been suicide. I've wondered about that too. I mean, look, he is, from a financial standpoint, he can afford the attorneys. Okay, so pleading not guilty makes sense in this case. From a reputational standpoint, the amount of information that's going to come out that might compel him to try to make some kind of a plea deal to cover anybody else, or to name some maybe limited specific others as part of that plea deal. Who knows? I think one of the things to think about is, my understanding is that minimum sentencing for the forcible sex trafficking is 15 years. I think that that's correct. I think some of the other charges carry much longer sentences. I've seen newspaper articles that suggest as much as life. He's not going to want to do, but if we just think about the minimums, he's not going to want to do 15. He can't do that time. And he can't do that time in a New York prison for sure. So he's going to have to name somebody else in the industry. There are any number of pictures of him with a variety of other people, including the now disgraced New York City mayor, at these parties. And frankly, over the past few weeks, at least since his arrest September 16th, in social media, there have been any number of rappers who have come out and artists who have come out and said, I never went to one of those parties. And the joke is, of course, is that as soon as they say that, someone posts on Instagram a picture of them at one of the parties because everybody was at those parties. So
for the record, I never went to a Diddy party. I was never elite. I was never dated a rapper. So I'm glad that so, wow. I think it's going to be fascinating to find out these people coming out of the woodwork and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think my prediction is that there will be other names. My prediction is that we could get a reckoning here. And I think that what I'm interested in most, that I think could make this case different, is Cassie, the young woman that we have the video of, who was kicked in the head outside of the elevator in the hotel room. You've probably seen that video. I think her testimony is going to be really important, and for the prosecution to follow that same sort of pattern for their case that her case involved. People like that are going to be really important, because Cassie not only is a victim, and also Rodney Jones, who I mentioned earlier. Those people are not only victims, but they were around to see other things happening in Sean Combs' world.
Yeah, well, I really hope for justice for so many. So
I do too. Yeah.
And I appreciate your time in talking about this. I know your book was just published this month in September.
Yeah.
It's not like you planned this to come out at the
No, I
time.
published this 4 days before Sean Combs was arrested.
I know, and that's why I was so. It just happened to work out that way, right?
Yeah.
So I'd love to promote your book. I'd love to continue to have conversations around this and just bring just awareness to this critical issue of just how insidious it is and how it can be happening in your own city, your town, like in your neighbor's house. It can be around you and you're not seeing it or even understanding how close it could affect you. Or I just think we really need to educate people, young people. I am a mother. Of course, I'm hyper aware. But I really think we need to teach our children, like, to never look. I mean, because, young people sneak out and go to a party or they talking to someone online. Like, we have to talk about that because that's how it starts. And it is our job to talk about this, even as young as you think, right? To talk about why you have open communication with your. I'm way too paranoid. Okay.
No, you're right. You're on the right track. That was how I was raised as a kid. I still remember riding up an elevator with my dad as a little kid. Stranger handed me a piece of candy. My daddy slapped that candy right out of my hands, and he said, "Don't you ever take anything from anybody that you don't know. Don't you ever." So, that's been with me my whole life. I think, it's a certain generation of us. It's just, we got the lesson. Okay.
We're just broken.
Right. There's that too. Yeah.
So I'm broken. I mean, like, anyone stranger approaches me for a compliment or trying to give you a flower or anything, I'm just right away sus, like, all the time. Like, but there's a reason why, and it's because I understand grooming, and I just, yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. And I want to have your book on Audible because I would love to have it read.
Yes, I'm working on that. It looks like I'm going to be doing the reading, so I'm working on that, working on getting into character for the different characters.
Okay, I'm down for that because I'm a huge fan on books on tape. Like, that
Okay.
got me through my entire life, driving, commuting to school, like, all the time. And then my son listens to books on tape. He worked, like, I mean, for years, like through the end of his high school and stuff in janitorial services. So he could listen 8 hours to books on tape. So he went through hundreds of books. So he's like a brainiac. But, like, to have books on tape for those of us that are like multitaskers, like,
Yeah.
I like to clean my house and listen, and then I get even a better clean.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife does the same. So she's been pushing me. It'll take a little bit, but I'm getting there. I'm ready to start recording a few test chapters next week.
Oh yeah, I love it. Oh, I'm ready for it. Okay, get
All
into
right.
character. Get into
All right.
character. I'll be waiting for this. And of course, you can find his book on Amazon. It's all there. And it's already got a 5-star rating. So I'm really excited to follow your journey and your success, as you continue to do interviews with people. And I'm excited for you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For episode details and merch, check out Killer Psychologist Podcast.com. And for forensic services, you can book online at psychologydr.com. That's psychologydoctor.com.